Thank you very much, Ashley. And on behalf of Africa Investor and Africa PLC, our trade tech and blockchain, trade finance and logistics platform, a very warm welcome to the first Africa Investor RegTech Investors Consultative Summit. As Ashley indicated, my name is Hubert Danso, and I am the CEO and Chairman of Africa Investor, and as I mentioned, Africa PLC, our e-trade and RegTech platform, as well as the African Union's Continental Business Network. And I will be chairing the proceedings for today's consultative summit. I think, as you may have read from the intro information, this event builds on the recent African e-trade leaders consultative summit that I convened and chaired with the Secretary Generals of the International Chamber of Commerce, Bern Union, the African Continental Free Trade Area Secretariat, the World Customs Organization, and the World Trade Organization. And our main focus there was to really look at the role of organized business and the private sector to bring digital and e-trade related solution in support of the African Continental Free Trade Area that's being championed and driven by our esteemed heads of state. And as a consequence of the outcome of that useful and far-reaching discussion, the African Union have requested us to host this particular follow-up RegTech Investors Consultative Summit, because a number of the issues that actually came out of that first discussion, it really pointed to how can technology intermediate a lot of the operational and the administrative issues associated with ensuring that the African Continental Free Trade Area can benefit from the likes of the tech. So I think, as you know, more generally across the actual sector, we've seen sort of a year-on-year increase of about 103% of investment into, and this is just in the last 3 quarters of 2019, that rise of investment into RegTech, which has made it one of the fastest, growing tech categories for global investors. So it's obvious and very clear to all of us, I'm sure, that the $3.2 trillion African Continental Free Trade Area could do well to benefit from some of this innovation and capital. So our objectives for today are essentially threefold. First of all, it's to consult all of you as the RegTech community and RegTech investors to assist us and our African Union heads of state and e-trade negotiators and stakeholders really provide input to assist with the negotiations of the e-commerce and the e-trade protocols that will be annexed to the African Continental Free Trade Area. The second is to feed into our policy position as the Continental Business Network and the African private sector that's currently being drafted and finalized as we speak, for which will be part of that same process fed into the African Union Development Agency and the African Continental Free Trade Area process and secretariat. And then the third and final key objective is really to look at areas of support for the Africa PLC e-trade platform, where we can bring and pilot new innovative RegTech related solutions as a go-to-market transactional and knowledge exchange platform that is in line with our mission. And our mission is really how to globalize African e-trade in support of the African Continental Free Trade Area. We will also run a few polls throughout the session. I think, as you would have seen from the program, this session is going to be broken up into 2 segments. The first one is really going to be looking at setting the scene and setting the stage for RegTech in Africa, and that's really going to be delving a bit more into identifying the trends, the challenges, ideally the opportunities, and the need that's really driving the interest in RegTech solutions more generally. And then in the second panel, we're really going to be talking a lot more about the sort of go-to-market opportunities, what investors are really doing. We're seeing some good examples of what's been invested in, and hopefully we'll come away with some very practical and specific examples of what we can invest in now, what we can review as a RegTech investment-related opportunity for the continent. But before we jump into the issues and into the first panel, I'm going to call on my good colleague and partner here, Ashley, just to run a bit of a poll for us here, which will be the first poll. And here we're really looking to get your initial perspectives on the impact of COVID-19 and the extent to which you believe that as a consequence of the increased digitalization, whether our negotiators should potentially accelerate the negotiation on e-trade and e-commerce that is currently scheduled for 2020, whether that should be accelerated to 2021. You should see the poll in front of you. It's a yes or a no answer. I'm not meaning to influence anyone, but I'm clicking yes. And I have just sent it through. Please do the same. And as and when the poll comes up, I'll be advised by my good colleague Ashley what the outcome and the results of that poll are. But I think let's proceed while the technology does what technology does. So as I mentioned, we are starting with the panel number one, which is setting the stage for RegTech opportunities in Africa. And as I mentioned, I'm joined by the leaders in this field. So, you know, we have 5 speakers that will be addressing these issues with us in this first panel, which will run for between 50 minutes to 1 hour. And our first esteemed panelist is Alistair Tempest, who is the CEO of the E-Commerce Forum of Africa. We have Devraj Basu, who is the Senior Lecturer in Finance at Strathclyde Business School. We have Mark Henderson, who is the founding partner at Agile Process Innovation. We have Michelle Chivungu, who is the founder and CEO and investor of the Global Policy House in the UK. And we have, last but by no means least, Paul Smith, who is the former president and CEO of the CFA Institute. So we're going to jump straight into this, and I'm going to start with you, Alistair. And you were very involved in a lot of the negotiations and bringing private sector perspectives together from the e-commerce community, working with a lot of the multilateral organizations in this space. So you're steeped in this. So I'd like you to just sort of give us a quick snapshot of your reflections of that process to date and the engagement with the private sector, but then really specifically and in line with this sort of consultative approach, I'd like your top 5 trade ecosystem problems that you feel RegTech could solve, but in particular, what business models you feel would appeal to RegTech investors from those same very ideas. And then finally, just in terms of the points I'd like from you, if you could just give us your 2 minutes with the president pitch in terms of what would your advice be to African heads of state on creating a hospitable environment for RegTechpreneurship. Over to you, Alistair.
Thank you very much indeed. I think one of the most important things that I've noticed in this whole process is that the African Union has invited the stakeholders in. So I sit, for example, on a digital trade, digital economy working party with Michelle, in fact. And we can therefore have an input into what's going on. But it's moved much faster than any of us expected, with the heads of state agreeing that e-commerce should be within phase 2, I think it is, of the negotiations on services. So that's a very good start. Now we've got to get ourselves prepared, and maybe we weren't quite expecting such a very fast move forward due to the COVID-19 problem. And what we have definitely seen on the continental level in nearly every single country is that e-commerce and the digital economy has moved forward by leaps and bounds because of the lockdown, and that's incredible. So you asked me for 5 different specific things that I would think of. And I think all of these things that I'm going to suggest are definitely things that RegTech investors might be interested in. And let me start with the first one. One of our main deliverables at the e-commerce forum Africa is to create a trust mark within Africa to try and encourage greater trust. What I would suggest is trying to find some sort of investment which would encourage that specifically for business to business. Business to consumer can come later, but business to business is the real thing. Business to business is the way in which the African Free Trade Area will move forward. And unless we can increase greater trust between businesses across the continent, we're not going to work. So what we would need is something like a blockchain verification system, which would allow us to see whether using a best practices guidelines to see whether company X or company Y, wherever it happened to be, in the middle of Mali or wherever, is actually following best practices, whether it is what it say it's going to be, what it claims it is, and also to have an alternative dispute resolution system involved within that, built into that. Now, there's a specific opportunity, and it is one which we think, in fact, a development aid body might be interested in funding. I mean, actually, we know which body might be interested. So as a specific thing, if anyone's interested in investing in that, delighted to hear. Another way in which we can move forward, I think, is again a verification system. The development of what's called the GS1 system in Africa. GS1 regulates the awarding of barcodes, QR codes, and RFIDs. And in Southern Africa, it's run by the Consumer Goods Council of South Africa. Our interest, again, there would be a matter of trust. The more we can reduce the amount of hazardous goods being sold by e-commerce, this is the downside, let's say, the bad side of e-commerce, the cowboys of e-commerce, the better it is. What we've noticed is that, for example, in Europe, the rapid alert system they have, which is called RAPEX, is recording increased amounts of sales of hazardous products. And the worst thing is that 80% of those are aimed at children. So in some way or another, the GS1 system would be a great thing to be able to invest in, to grow it and make it expand across Africa. And of course, there's a business model in that, a very clear one. And indeed, even to create a RAPEX database for Africa. Another issue which I'm particularly interested in because they're members of my board is the East African Community Trademark East Africa, which I'm sure you've heard of. Now that was paid for originally by development aid. And what it's done is work with the 6 member states of the East African community in order to improve cross-border trade. They've got the amount of time for lorries going cross-border between, for example, Kenya and Uganda down to 15 minutes now, instead of 6 or 9 hours that it used to be in the past. Why not a system in other countries of a trademark East Africa, a replica of them? And again, there are certainly business models that can be built out of that. And I think that would be a tremendous thing to get things going. Another issue which would be of great interest is the problem that we have in e-commerce. When selling across borders, if the consumer or the business returns the product, how do you deal with that? It's called reverse logistics. So again, how can we find ways in which reverse logistics can be solved? Working with, for example, the postal operators and couriers, etc. So it would be a sort of business to business and business to consumer issue there. But again, I think a business model can be worked out. And finally, something which, I mean, I'm a European originally. I've lived in South Africa for only 10 years. And as a European living in Brussels, I'm very aware of the difficulty of language. The African Union has been very clever in only choosing 4 different languages. Maybe Swahili will come as the 5th one. But there are those hundreds of thousands of local languages, and investing in interpretation and translation systems to allow business to deal with consumers who may not be fully conversant with even the official languages of their own country is a tremendous thing to close the digital gap, because this is one of our issues, isn't it? To try and close that digital divide and stop the increase of digital poverty. So I would suggest that as my 5th suggestion, if I may. All of them, I think, have got very good business models that can be created simply for investment. And yes, I mean, one of our issues, one of the things that we identified, 13 different things that we considered to be challenges in Africa, was the problem of investment. This is still a very big issue. How can companies be created to do e-commerce, whether it's business to business or business to consumer? And how can they get funding, et cetera, et cetera. So this is the elephant in the corner for us all. And I think it's one where this platform, amongst others, can be incredibly helpful. So Hubert, thank you very much indeed for inviting me, and let's talk more.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much, Alistair. You touched on, as I know, a lot of, and with great passion, a lot of the key issues as well as opportunities. In terms of elephants, I think we're going to go elephant hunting in panel 2, where we've got a lot of our investors there that hopefully are going to work with us to not only identify and highlight the important things they need to accomplish, but how we can, get the right levels of capital formation to deploy to some of those really interesting ideas that you and other panelists are going to raise. I think one of the important things that you touched on quite a bit was trust. And I think, unfortunately, we live in a continent and we live in a world where in some cases the messenger is more important than the message. And I'm not sure that even coming out of this, we might end up with a different message. But I think if the messenger is, holding the capital, they seem to get a lot more attention than those who share the same message that are not necessarily owning the capital or owning the consumption capacity. So I'm now going to turn to Devraj and really just try to get his views on some foundational issues, because it's okay for us to talk about RegTech. It's a very sophisticated and sort of ever-growing global tech category. But in the continent, we really have to start laying some foundations and building out ecosystems that are RegTech focused, in addition and to complement all of the important work that we're doing, you're doing, and a number of the other stakeholders are pursuing. So Devraj, I'd just like to call on you. And for those who don't know, Devraj is one of the real pioneers based out of Europe that is really driving RegTech ecosystems and leveraging, all of that sort of pent up next generational intellectual capital that resides within universities and the youth generation. So Devraj, I'd like to really get your views initially on the role that you believe academia can play and assist us on the continent to lay that strong foundational RegTech industry base. And then also I'd like you to please address this issue of, just sharing your insights. We want to avoid some of the mistakes that you may have made or some of the lessons that you learned in building an ecosystem, around the RegTech space. So if you could just share with us some suggestions on the role that you think academia can play in establishing a solid foundation for RegTech in Africa, and then just share with us some of your experiences building your RegTech ecosystem, within your constituency, and some of the things that you would recommend we do, and some of the lessons that you've learned that you would recommend that we do not. Over to you.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Great pleasure to be here, and thank you again for the opportunity. And thank you for the introduction. Yes, some of it is even true. So I have to say,
whatever, don't you?
But the thing that Hubert speaks to is so a little bit of background to all of this. Within Scotland, there is this effort to try to create an overall fintech ecosystem. And that has been pioneered by a number of organizations within Scotland, most notably FinTech Scotland. And sort of the tireless efforts of FinTech Scotland have really brought this notion of ecosystem to the fore. Now, where sort of Strathclyde and I come in is to try to specialize that a little into the context of RegTech. And to sort of go to Hubert's question, so what is the role of academia? And this is something that we've been talking about quite a bit. Maybe could I summarize it in 2 words? Honest broker.
Okay.
So you stand between, as an honest broker between, and I'll sort of try to answer both questions at the same time. So to the second question of what have we learned? So the experiences of the Scottish ecosystem are that, and I think this is probably likely to be universal, that on the one side, there are the smaller companies, the fintechs and the regtechs, and on the other side are the larger organizations. Now, we primarily look at financial service organizations, but doesn't have to be that. Any data-driven organization, so that spans a fairly wide range. If I can grossly oversimplify, the basic learning has been, and this I think is fairly obvious at one level, the smaller companies tend to be simpler in organization, but much more innovative in what they do, whereas the larger organizations tend to be much, much more complex, and they tend to be perhaps less innovative. So what then is the role of sort of academia is to basically bridge this divide. So in the specific, so again, to make it quite specific to RegTech, one of the things we try to do is try to step in there and bridge that divide. Now, this is a particularly difficult task. So you try to sort of address, so there are 2 essential questions that you can, or 2 essential issues that you can try to address. On perhaps the fintech side or the RegTech side, the smaller company side, you can try to spur innovation. You can try to understand what their innovative models are. And then on the other side, the side of the larger companies, try to identify the challenges, the institutional challenges that they face. And the role of the honest broker then becomes trying to bring those 2 together. Okay, so for example, how could you go about doing this? So what is a key attribute of the honest broker in all of this? The notion of disinterestedness. They are neutral in that they are trying to understand the problem as holistically as possible, not from a specific perspective, from a disinterested perspective, and as opposed to perhaps a more commercial organization who is trying to analyze it for a particular motive. Here you're trying to take a holistic view on the problem. And so in the specific issue of RegTech, it then comes down to understanding innovation on one side, understanding challenges on the other, and trying to bring them together. So what can academia itself, in addition to that, what can it do? So I think following on from that, its most crucial role would be in skills provision. Okay, so once you've been able, the honest broker has been able to understand on the one side the innovation and on the other side the challenges, now formulate a skills provision package. And this, for example, is something that Mark will talk much more about. So it doesn't have to come exclusively from academia. You harness all of the players in that ecosystem ideally to come together with this basic skills package. And when I say skills, I mean it's not directed at a single level. Skills are across the board. This starts from the C-suite going down to entry-level jobs. So you're saying, maybe I should have started at this. So maybe if I can just quickly define RegTech, so it's useful to have a definition. So if you define RegTech as a use of technology and data analytics to make compliance and risk management, regulation, compliance and risk management better, cheaper, and more efficient, okay? Then you understand that you're dealing with a disruptive phenomena. So you're dealing with a disruptive phenomena, which is likely to change the very architecture of how things have been done. So you use this sort of challenges and innovation framework to try to understand that in a disinterested manner. And then you try to create a skills package based on that. So very simply, much more concretely, in RegTech, what will the jobs of the future look like? These are what the jobs of the future look like. So what would people in RegTech, what sort of skills would they need to have? And then start with that and then sort of map it into sort of existing. So that's I think the bulk of it. So what have we learned? We've only just begun this. We've been doing this for we've been doing the whole fintech thing for about a year and a half now, but the RegTech specialization has only started maybe 3 or 4 months. What we've learned is this is a long game. Okay, so this is a long game because it's a word that, I go back to a word that was used in Alistair's presentation. What is crucial in all of this is building trust. Building a community of trust. Because the knowledge required to implement this sort of new architecture of RegTech, if you will, does not reside with any single individual, certainly not any single group of individuals. It resides within that entire extended community. And if it has to succeed, it has to mean that the community has to come together around what you might call a common minimum program, at least, to try to evolve. And I think this echoes a lot of the things that Alistair was saying in his presentation. It's just perhaps more abstract. So he was giving some very concrete examples of that. All I would say is I'm sort of just approaching this from a more abstract setting. And academia has a key role to play because disinterestedness, as I said, is crucial in all of this. Because that is a characteristic that can win the trust of all the players in the ecosystem. But this is a long process. So you need to try to divide it into, you need to have sort of staging posts and clear milestones. But it's also an emergent phenomena, which means that you can start somewhere, you may intend to go somewhere, you may end up somewhere quite different. So, that's sort of been the lesson so far.
Thanks very much, Steve. That's a fascinating journey. I think you have a bit of an echo. Hopefully you can hear me without the echo now. That's a fascinating journey. We had, interestingly, another consultation with our group of sovereign investors just Friday past, and we had Lord Jim O'Neill, the former chairman of Goldman Sachs, that came up with the term bricks that the heads of state then picked up on. And one of the points that he made, and a number of the other sovereign investors that are part of our work have made, is that because of the COVID-19, we could really emerge as the continent in a very different and much stronger geopolitical and economic position if we harness opportunities through tech, as well as the great platform that's been constituted through the African Continental Free Trade Area. And one of the big messages that keeps coming through, and I'm going to turn to Mark now to share his views on this, is the fact that our underdevelopment is almost our strongest advantage in terms of being able to give us a better platform not to be weighed down with so many legacy practices or legacy technology. We can actually really leapfrog a lot of the challenges that other markets have gone through and emerge a very different and much more attractive and competitive investment destination and trading destination. So, and coming back to your point, Devraj, so I've heard of disintermediation. Now you're introducing disinterested. So I turn to you, Mark, and one of the first things I'd like you to address is, should we be disinterested in learning from some of the existing models that Europe and North Africa and elsewhere in the OECD markets have experienced? So I'd like your recommendations and views on how we can take very practical steps to leapfrog some of the OECD type models to date, and get your view on whether you believe that we could emerge as one of the global leaders in RegTech or trade tech. And then finally, I'd like you to just share your views on the top 5 incentives and policies that you'd recommend be put in place to spur RegTech innovation and development across the continent's $3.2 trillion African Continental Free Trade Area opportunity. Over to you, Mark.
Thanks, Hubert. I'm going to be honest with you, to answer your questions probably take a better man than me, but I'll certainly share my experience of somebody who is an entrepreneur within the tech space and having to address some of the fundamental issues that we found. So I mean, sort of picking up both on Alistair and on Devraj, is that innovation itself, and what you're talking about, is an incredible innovative journey. It's actually quite fragile. And I think there's a sense that, back to your point, the advantages and disadvantages is that I really feel that Africa in itself, yes, is good to look to other regions within Europe and in the US, but actually it's a journey that you need to take ownership of yourself. Because when I think about just what you've described and what's been talked about over the last 10 or 15 minutes, is that actually there's a huge amount of work to be done. And how are we going to resource that and drive that forward in a way that at a pace that you want to achieve? So what COVID has done is accelerate where people are talking about 6 years of digitization being done in 3 or 4 months, to move things forward. And I think Africa as a nation and the continent has got some really interesting demographics. And that's where, you basically have the world's 10 youngest populations. And so if you go down a traditional route of development, which Silicon Valley or even the big companies, and I've nothing against them, companies like IBMs of the world would push you, is you basically need a huge amount of development capacity to actually be able to drive that journey. And I think that capacity to transform in a traditional way is something that you really need to actually be challenging. And this is where, I guess, as somebody who's struggling in this space myself, is that we've really focused on this whole rise of no-code, low-code type technologies. And as Devraj said, is that a lot of these technologies are actually coming out themselves out of startup incubators, innovation. And it's how do we harness that and make a kind of almost a commitment that technology-wise we're actually going to take a route of democratizing this technology across the continent, rather than looking to one or two key, like, you know, technical superpowers to actually provide that capacity, you know, that journey. And I think so. That's one aspect, is actually acknowledging, and where we acknowledge basically the demographic, but also acknowledge that how are we going to actually harness and train. So back to Devraj's point, I guess the area that I'm focusing on personally is that whole secondary, almost before university. How do we start to create that pipeline of interested young people who want to actually come into this industry that we're going to need over the next decade? And through things like apprenticeship programs, startup apprenticeship, which is, I'm literally in the middle of one just now. I think the other point I also think a lot about is the economics. So one of the things is that even in Scotland, the economics that work are not the same economics that work, for example, in the US, or even actually south of the border in London. We need to make sure that when we choose these solutions that we're actually looking at the cost. So it's very easy at one level, the cost per transaction, but we actually need to look at what does it cost to develop, what does it cost to maintain, and what does it cost to operate. So if I'm going to build something, it needs to be at a level that allows actually the small, medium enterprise to actually participate. And if that's something that actually we really, really struggle within, within Scotland, as an example, to get companies that are, less than 20 million turnover, for example, to really look at the digitization of their administrative processes, etc. How do we actually, well, we need to drive not only just the development cost down, but we've also got to drive down the cost of software and the approach that we're taking. So I think just on your, so they're just, I guess they're the two things, I guess, when we talked about this, Hubert, that I kind of thought about, and I think it's actually something where it's really important, and this kind of moves on to the final point, is almost that ownership about how are people going to participate within the African continent. Because there's a danger that if with big companies are going to bring big costs and big ideas, but actually we should also look to the innovation that is already on the ground, and how can we actually harness that, and always keeping an eye on those people that are really driving towards that low code, no code approach to how they're deploying things. So the 5 things I really I'm absolutely passionate is about the education, and it's not just the university level and creating those innovation hubs, it's getting right back. I'll tell you a very small story. Is my daughter, she wants to be a scientist now, but she made up her mind in primary 6. And I guess for me, that sticks in my mind, that whatever we do from an education point of view, we actually need to think in decades, go right back and think about how are we actually going to capture the imagination of the next generation and pull them through so that, and some of those will want to go to university, some will want to go a different pathway, but as a ways of us actually capturing that imagination and starting to harness it into our economy, and particularly into the digital economy and the e-commerce economy as we go forward. The second thing is choose wisely, I think, about the approach that you take to development. So the kind of software, and there's lots of good stuff that's starting to reach a maturity point where I don't need to be a developer. I can actually be an experienced business user who can then harness that development to actually drive and advance and digitize what it is I'm actually trying to do. I think the third thing is around, we are looking at this in Scotland, is around how do we incentivize businesses that are they're beyond scale up, but to really grow, they need to spend and expand using a digital approach rather than continuing to purely invest human capital into it. How do we actually create some form of incentive or investment not only in startups that are creating the new technologies, but also invest into companies that may then become the consumers of this technology, because we need to recognize, again, the economics of that can be quite hard for those companies. And I think, picking up on Deborah's thing, is that the whole thing of the incubator, so as part of creating this trust, is also creating an environment where we take the fragility of innovation and actually create incubators of ideas where there's focused themes around RegTech, digital economy, e-commerce, where there's funding, resourcing, skilling. We talked about reverse mentoring before, Hubert. At the minute, I've got a 19-year-old who works with me. He actually gives me so much energy because he's full of ideas, and that kind of harnessing of actually working in collaboration with the younger generation, I think, is really critical in that. And I think then the final point, which I've already touched upon, is really, I really feel a sense of grasp a hold of ownership. And I don't think this is something that, don't let US or Europe drive you on the route, because I don't actually think their models are necessarily going to give you things that you want at the speed that you want, at the cost that you want. That's my tuppence worth on it, Hubert, right? As somebody who's, trying to function within this space myself and create a pipeline and put the resources in place so that as the good ideas come in, we actually have those people who are aligned and trained in the technologies that we need to actually accelerate and drive this forward. So thanks for that, Hubert.
Thanks very much, Mark. Really, really good, and as usual, practical insights. And I think, that hotbed for development, as you know, that's what we're working on at Africa PLC, where we're creating a transactional platform that people can develop and then bring their products to market. The other big issue that you picked up on that I like a great deal is the reality that, we have to democratize technology. And in doing so, this whole low code, no code, more affordable technology is going to be very transformative indeed. So that's a very big issue. But again, and we'll hear a lot more about this in panel 2, who's going to fund this? What are the different funding models? And one of the key drivers behind that, to a large extent is there a niche in the market for what we're talking about is one consideration that we need to think about. But then it's not just about, is there a niche in the market? Is there a market in the niche? Because at the end of the day, there's got to be a buy-sell proposition that can move towards sustainability. So with that, I'm going to move to Michelle, because I'm going to be looking to Michelle to just talk about this whole issue. Now, we've heard some great ideas and we've alluded to investability related to those ideas. So I'm really going to ask Michelle to address the same issue, top 5 trade related ecosystem challenges that you think RegTech could solve, and why they should appeal to investors as a result. But I want you, Michelle, please, to just build out a bit, because we spend a lot of time talking about the problems and, pontificating as to whether we can solve our problems. So I'd really be interested for you to go beyond that and talk about why solving these problems is a commercially sensible thing and why these problems are investable. Over to you, Michelle.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Hubert. Some really interesting input so far. And absolutely, I think I'll, pick up from the point around, why should we be looking into digitization. I think this is what the conversation has been about. And there are, sort of fundamental issues that are more particularly relevant in the African context. Obviously, we are at the moment facing several crises, but I think as, a lot of people have been saying, I think the crisis isn't necessarily just about COVID or healthcare. I think, in the context of Africa, we face many crises, including things around things like, food security and people being able to, to have the opportunities. We We talked about young people, opportunities for jobs, opportunities for creativity, opportunity for innovation. Now when you take it down into the level of trade, one of the areas that I do speak a lot about is around, SMEs and supporting the small medium enterprises, which are pretty much the engines of growth for Africa. So when we're talking in the context of, development and looking ahead and what the free trade area really is about, is very much around about interregional trade, and how do we foster that? How do we develop that? How do we ensure the players within the ecosystem are actually equipped to be able to, to contribute and help us grow that GDP. So I think fundamental in that respect, but also in terms of where we're moving ahead. We're obviously looking towards the future now, and the future has come knocking on our door very, very fast because of COVID. And I really think in terms of digitization, when you look at trade, for example, there's some fundamental areas where we need to start to look at improving trade. One of those areas have been mentioned already. I mean, when you're starting to create that trust system. So we need an ecosystem where, there's a lot more trust. We need an ecosystem where there's a lot more transparency. We need an ecosystem where people are a little bit more confident that, okay, if I am, sending my goods between Nigeria to Kenya, my goods are going to get there in time. I'm going to get paid in time as an SME. I'm not going to have to sit for hours and hours or worry about my documentation. I have to fill this documentation. It takes, 15, 20 days before I can get any funding from the bank. So there's a whole range of complexities that we need to address within the whole trade ecosystem. You're looking at things like trade financing. How do you ensure that the small players, for example, in Africa, are actually able to access the finance that they need? Very, very difficult in many respects. So what are the solutions in my view? I mean, there's several solutions. Yes, number one, technology is going to play a critical role. And we've seen that overnight with the introduction of COVID-19. But I think technology is just one answer. The others have been very much outlined already around equipping people and educating people. I'm a big champion on education. But we do need to invest in the basics. We need to invest in education. We need to invest in public healthcare. We need to invest in a whole range of things. Now back to my area that I have been covering, around sort of digitization. Some of the tools that are available for us today, and these are there and ready today. If you're leveraging technologies like blockchain, for example, you're using big data. When I'm talking about big data, huge amounts of data sets that we're producing almost every day. We are, I think, failing to kind of capture the data sets that are there. Who owns kind of the data centers? How much access do we have to those data centers in order for us to utilize, analytics, be it AI and a whole range of other different technologies that you can utilize to start reading those data sets to give you some very informative, information around how to utilize that data to inform either policy or to inform even new business models. So we need to start to look very, very clearly and very, very, strongly around the data arguments. So data is very much the underlining, gold, that the golden thread that is spread all across when it comes to kind of technology. So depending what technology you're talking about, be it drones, be it AI, be it big data, data is very, very much at the heart of that. And I think we need to start to emphasize a little bit more in terms of understanding data, making sure that we're utilizing quality data. It's not just about any data. Quality data, managing data, and having access to data is very, very important. But the number one, huge factor here as well is also making sure that, all countries across Africa, I think, should be investing, in both digital and physical infrastructure. Number one, that is absolutely critical moving forward. If we are going to move forward, be it in the digital economy or in the sort of informal economy, we need to start to look at placing these fundamentals in place, number one, before I go into even the solution I'm about to suggest. So we need to have those fundamental basic elements in place, number one. Number two, we need to be able to start leveraging what is actually out in the marketplace. So, you have technologies like blockchain, for example. Blockchain is the trust machine. Blockchain is going to help to enable trust, through trustless systems, through trustless networks. So all of us, might not be able to know each other. We might never have met ever before, but should be able to trade and do business across borders, be able to interact with one another without necessarily having met. This is because blockchain enables that transparency, that trust, that ability for all of us to connect, through networks and through security. And I suppose the security comes from, the encryption and the coded kind of programming that comes with the development of software or blockchain. So in fact, you're not necessarily relying on trust from each other, from humans, but you're relying on trust on the code that is being utilized to enable us to interact and engage. So With the blockchain platform in place, you can have documentation that is digitized and placed onto the blockchain securely, and that information is there, it's secure. So if I want to place my information, people know that this is Michelle. They can track Michelle through this digital ID that I have. And through my ID, for example, if I own land in Zambia, which is where I come from, and I want that land to be recognized for me, and I don't have to fight with 100 of my relatives about land, that land can be placed onto the blockchain. You can track it very, very easily. Same with the supply chain. So supply chain at the moment is very, very difficult to know when goods are moving from A to B, when they get to customs, and then you have to fill all sorts of documentation. How do we improve that whole process end to end? You can utilize, blockchain and other technology as well. Blockchain is not necessarily beneficial working in isolation. We have to start to, put the technologies together and really that's where you start leveraging value by, utilizing the technologies together. So tap on the technologies for sure, but also start to build the basic infrastructures in place that are necessary in order to implement these technologies. Number one, my recommendation. Number two, we have to look at, digitizing documentation, I think, especially when it comes to trade and e-trade. And we're looking at end-to-end digitization solutions in place here. Not necessarily we're going to digitize just one element and then that's good to go. No, we need to look at end-to-end solutions in place. And there are many, many examples already that are happening, with companies like Bolero. Even in Africa, there are many, many, early stage startups that are starting to look at the process and how you manage that. And number three, one of the other recommendation I have is very much back to data again. Governments especially need to be able to start to analyze, have they got data localization laws in place to ensure that, the security of data, to ensure the end user has a bit more control, with usage of their data. How do we look at actually enforcement around, breakages around not following the protocols that are in place? Very, very important. So these are clear recommendations for governments that should be happening now. When you're looking at new innovative financing models, the other challenge I think we have on the continent is actually access to liquidity and access to financing. We need to start to strengthen the local, national, regional capital markets. Yeah, and building new liquidity coming into the space. So if we're building liquidity internally within Africa and starting to invest in strong capital markets, that is going to help to drive and introduce new models of financing. This is particularly critical, I think, for SMEs. A lot of our SMEs are women, are young people. They are in informal settings to a large degree. They are the major players in selling in agribusiness and a whole range of different areas. How equipped are they in terms of access to finance? Very, very difficult sometimes. So how do we start to create an economy that allows, SMEs and a range of others to actually have access to finance? We need to strengthen our capital markets, but we also need to bring that enabling environment that allows for new players to come in, so new players who have new different offerings in terms of financing. So I'm talking about things like decentralized finance, where again, you're using blockchain-based financing, where you're decentralizing access to finance. You're looking at things like microfinancing, which is very, very relevant for SMEs, particularly in Africa. So all that needs to be looked at. In terms of investors, I think a very big call for investors from myself. I think investors have a huge role to play here in terms of actually starting to invest in what I call, the platform economy, right? We need to build more platforms across Africa that are driven and owned by Africans, and investors have a big role to come and start investing in those companies that are starting to build the platform economy. The platform economy enables that connectivity I talked about, that access to market, that opportunity for young entrepreneurs, women-led businesses to come in and actually be supported. Then we need to look at investing in SMEs, as I said earlier on. We need to start to looking at building, simple things, education. Overnight across the world, doesn't matter, developed or undeveloped countries, overnight you've had to go virtual. You've had to go and, digitize. So we look at education. How are we actually educating our young people? Are they prepared for the next skill sets that are required in jobs that will be created in the future? I believe young people also have opportunity to create the jobs. So we're not sitting and just waiting on government to, I'm waiting for the government to give me, opportunity for work, or private sector. No, I want to create the next set of jobs by either being a data scientist, by either being a software engineer, and this is already happening in Africa. I've seen many young people, Ghana, Kenya, Nigeria, Zambia, where they are playing with things like cryptocurrency and starting to understand, okay, what does this crypto mean? Partly because in some areas, there's a bit of necessity to do that. There isn't access to the dollar, the local currency, and it's very difficult. The valuations are up and down. So people are starting to play around with new modes of finance. How do we educate young people so that they're prepared and they can compete with their peers across the world, right? This is very important, I think, for Africa. If we're going to drive Africa, how do you get new negotiators in Africa that are equipped, that can go and negotiate, like to Mark's point, that Africa has to drive its own agenda. How do we equip young people and other, future negotiators to go and negotiate for Africa, to place, to give really valid negotiations that is beneficial to the continent. So all that, I'm a big fan of education, very, very big fan of education. I think we need to educate. My company's strapline is very much around, in making sure that we leave no one behind, by obviously educating around sort of the digital element, but also looking at other structures. So education is pretty critical. Investment into the right laws and regulations, and for governments creating a climate for innovators to play is very important. Harnessing financing, and this is where investors come in. Investors can be reassured that investing in Africa is not so risky, because we're starting to introduce, blockchain-based platforms where you can have KYC, AML, embedded into the system, so they're not worrying about due diligence or worrying about, these projects I'm pumping money into are not viable projects, right? We have the tools and the systems in place that gives you that reassurance that what you're investing in is legit, the people you're investing in are legit. You've got that platform where you're part of the network, where you can decide and have consensus about how your money is utilized and where your money goes, and you can track and you can monitor and you can see all that. That's where we're moving towards. Massive opportunities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michelle. Do you get time to sleep? Obviously, your ideas are just keeping you awake. And but if it's any consolation, you and me both. And I think you've touched on a lot of the key issues. I'm really glad that you've mentioned SMEs, because that's front and center of our reality and our opportunity on the continent. I also subscribe to and believe, educate and they will come. That's one of our biggest, with our youth bulge and our ability to unlock and unleash our entrepreneurial spirit. I think if we can focus it and channel it and capacitate it, and that's both through formal education systems as well as life learning, as we've all been able to accomplish. Blockchain, the immutability and the trust nature that comes with that, and the ability to help everyone understand that it's not all and only about cryptocurrency, but there's a really valuable architecture and infrastructure in blockchain. But again, I think we are almost coming full circle on a point that was raised earlier, which is this trust and the ecosystem. And I think we have to be frank. We're at the very early stages of establishing that for the RegTech community in the continent. And it's great that some of us operate at a very high level, but sometimes we're just so far away from reality.
Yeah.
And we've got to be able to interconnect with the youth and the SMEs and create that market participant, regulator, average person and real beneficiary on the street. I'm going to turn to Paul now. Paul, I'd really like your insights and input. I mean, you are the president and CEO of the CFA, Chartered Financial Analysts Association globally. So education, market innovation was your day job for a very, very long time. We speak about a number of these issues, and our heads always try to be 10, 15, 20 years ahead of where we are today. So I'm really looking forward to some of your comments on that. But two things I'd like you to address. Again, in keeping with your 2 minutes with the heads of state, what are your top 5 trade-related ecosystem problems that you feel RegTech could solve, and what business models would you apply to that? And then back to my initial point, how can we foster closer partnerships between market participants, RegTech investors, RegTech developers, regulators, and then be able to draw the distinction between a regulator and a policymaker? Over to you, Paul, sorry.
Good day to everybody. It's wonderful to be addressing you. I'm actually speaking from Hong Kong at the moment, and I think that's interesting. We are a part of China, and I think China has many touch points of similarity with Africa in that, as some of the panelists have mentioned, I mean, what we're involved in Africa is trying to leap over various stages of development, avoid the bricks and mortar stage, and move on to new business models. And I think it's very instructive to think about some of the developments that have occurred in China, because they have had and coped with many of the issues that we've talked about. I mean, essentially for me, RegTech helps increase consistency, produce scale, widen the distribution of products, develop new products, and above all else, as other panelists have mentioned, build trusts. When you look at all of the surveys of professionalism and the professions that people trust most, financial technology, or technology in general, is always right at the top of the tree. So I would certainly urge that upon, if I had that 2 minutes with heads of state, Hubert, I think that would be my first message, that through technology you can actually build trust between all participants in the system, but most importantly with the investing public. And so I think that's a very important message. One of the challenges that I've seen around the world is that there is a huge chasm, to your second question really, between the regulators and market participants. And I obviously come from the financial services world, and nowhere is that more apparent than in that area. Regulators in finance tend to overemphasize their role in controlling the market and underemphasize their role in developing the market. On the mirror image of that, professionals, unfortunately, financial types tend to overestimate or overemphasize the role that their own profitability plays, and underestimate the fact that their main function in life is to help economies grow. So what needs to be done between regulators and the industry is for the industry to recognize that actually finance isn't set up to benefit financial people. Finance is set up to benefit the economies that we all serve, and regulators need to pay more attention to market development and less attention to market control. And I think if we can have a more constructive dialogue around that, a more regular dialogue around that, then I think a lot of those problems can fall away. Turning to the things from a finance perspective, I mean, everyone has mentioned, or a lot of panelists have mentioned, education. The democratization and access to education, I think, is the single biggest thing that RegTech can do. If you think about everything that we've just gone through with COVID, all of the homeschooling that our children are enduring at the moment, you think about that business model multiplied by a million times. You can bring Eton College, the best school arguably in Britain, you can bring Eton to billions of people going forward, quite literally. And I think that's the biggest issue, that's the biggest challenge that we face, is how do we democratize education? I look at it really from a financial perspective, but we now have this wonderful opportunity, not just of increasing financial education around the world, but we have this opportunity of democratizing education from Form 1 all the way through to university. And I think that's the opportunity that the world can't afford to fumble. Secondly, I think Michelle absolutely nailed it. Blockchain for contracts is key. And I rather than go back over everything that Michelle said, which I think was absolutely right, I would add to it labor contracts. I think that's a very important business opportunity that too often, particularly in the developing world, labor is insecure because of a lack of contractual relationship between employer and employee, and often where those terms of trade are unfairly changed partway through the term of service. The blockchain can help in terms of securing contractual rights on the chain so that there is no argument as far as that is concerned. Payments, absolutely essential. Again, Michelle said it, there's absolutely no reason why we can't have a Pan-African payment system that is secure. Turning to a little micro idea, really, KYC, AML, again, Michelle mentioned that, but just think about that in terms of financial markets, in terms of people trading on stock exchange, the need to retailize our financial investors in mutual funds, pension plans, and stock exchanges. AML, KYC challenges fall away in a new technology environment that will help mobilize retail investors much more creatively than we've ever done in the past. And then an idea that's slightly to the left of center, the securitization through the blockchain. You can securitize all types of assets. You can tokenize assets. That's a sort of a development of cryptocurrency, if you like, but tokenizing things like cars, houses, businesses, so that you can give access to those SMEs, those SMEs can get access to microfinancing, is something that is very definitely there today and an enormous business opportunity for Africa's investment banks. And then the final point that I would make is that through technology, access to all for insurance, housing loans, and consumer loans, again, is a very obvious financial good that should come out of RegTech. But to do all of that, you need a regulator who is excited by the opportunities behind technology and is working in partnership with a finance industry that first and foremost views its function in life as adding value to the communities that it serves. And that's basically where I think we can marry these ideas of regulation and technology better.
Thank you very much, Paul. Democratizing education, as you say, or as Mark also says, reverse mentoring. So there's certainly a way for us to be able to intermediate education, not only at the sort of youth level, but also, as you say, within companies. This whole concept of stakeholder capitalism, that we can also lend some of our key attention to that third bottom line and ability to be able to focus on growing the economy within which we and our families and our communities exist, is another critical forward-looking thought. And that's very much on the mind of the millennials, Gen X, our families and friends and communities. And the same applies to regulators. So very much take the point that the market development mandate should not be grossly overshadowed by the market control agenda, because of the harmful impacts that as a result will have or could have on economic growth, job creation, and all of the social and economic things that we seek to pursue. But that, with Paul's last comments, we've arrived at the last speaker for the first panel. And I'm curious to understand whether we're really on the right track. And I think one of the ways of finding out whether we're on the right track is, and in terms of what we see for the African Continental Free Trade Area, is to just get the results of our first poll. So Ashley, if I can ask you, where we ask that question, is this an important enough issue for us to now prioritize it and go to heads of state from the African Union and say, should we call on them to accelerate the negotiation and implementation of the e-commerce and e-trade protocols of the African Continental Free Trade Area? After Ashley shares the results, I'm just going to go to a few questions that we've received. Over to you, Ashley. Impressive. I challenge anyone to argue with that. That is phenomenal. This is a very strong message from all of the leaders and stakeholders participating within this particular discussion. This is being live streamed live to millions of people on YouTube and Facebook. Thank you for your participation in this survey, which is a resounding please, our political leaders. We support you and we encourage you to please accelerate the negotiations of the e-commerce and trade protocol to a 2021 agenda as distinct from the current 2022. Thank you, Ashley. So there are a few questions that we have, and I'm just going to quickly rush through them in the interest of time. One was, what's been the feedback on Ghana's year of return, and are there numbers in remittances, investments, and that have been released to date? The other is, what countries on the continent serve as positive models for internet protocols within internet security protocols within e-commerce, and what countries and markets will be most impacted within to Africa's submarine digital framework that's currently being built. If anyone can just pick off one of those to address, I'd be grateful. Thank you. My fellow panelists.
Hubert, I can come in on the Ghana question.
Okay.
So that's year of return. I think certainly from what, I'm not Ghanaian myself, I've been to Ghana several times. I love it. I think one of the, sort of feedback with that initiative is that it's really helped to connect, for example, the diaspora. Often, sometimes when we talk a little bit about Africa, the diaspora sometimes is a little bit kind of left on the side there, but I think the diaspora, for example, plays a very, very critical role in terms of growth as well. If you think about things like remittances and, amount of remittances that go, the flow of remittances and all that coming from either migrant workers and a whole range of other things. Certainly the year of return, I think, exemplified the importance of ensuring that connection. And I think a lot of other African countries, I think, can actually implement similar initiatives, I think, to support and incentivize, diaspora and others to actually start to contribute to what's happening on the continent. And of course, a lot of people who are in the diaspora might have been, away for quite some time, so are probably a little bit unfamiliar in terms of what's happening on the ground. So I think that initiative is a great example in terms of connectivity. As we move ahead, we need to be able to, to connect a little bit better and ensure that there's a bit more contribution. So I think there's been some positive, returns from that. And even in terms of sort of GDP and growth, I think they generated quite a lot of, revenue coming out of that activity from the Ghana side.
Fantastic. Any other views on the questions raised? Alistair, over to you.
On the security issues, this is a really big problem, I think. If Europe and America are not ready for cybercrime, Africa is certainly far behind that. It's one of the issues that I personally have been very interested in for a long time. I think that because of the growth of broadband and connections in Africa, and also because cyber criminals are very clever, and therefore they're right at the top of any new move forward. They've moved into mobile cybercrime. They're not just on your PC. They're looking at mobile, which actually is much more vulnerable than most people remember, because you do tend to store a lot of information on your mobile. So yes, it really does need some serious thinking about, and not even probably Mauritius, the best country, but even countries like South Africa are far behind the curve on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Alistair. So with that, and in the interest of time, we're about to bring this first scene-setting panel to a close. But I just urge all of our panelists and viewers to think about one thing. We are convening this at the request of political leaders and because we have an interest. So as we look at this in the context of the African Continental Free Trade Area, I always lament that I spoke at a recent regional conference for the International Chamber of Commerce with all of the chambers and the business leaders from across the continent. And I always encouraged the SME community and the business community not to be asking people like me or others or politicians about the prospects for success of the African Continental Free Trade Area, but rather we should be asking ourselves, what can we do as the traders and the drivers and the beneficiaries to make it a success? So I just close by encouraging all of the young people watching to know that this is your economy, it's our economy, and it will only be a success if we, the actors in the ecosystem, drive innovation and be relentless in our pursuit of transformation. So with that said, thank you very much, all of the panelists for this first scene setting session. It's been very educational for me and hopefully everybody. But to close us out, we're going to go to our next polling question that Ashley is going to put on the screen for us all to respond to. And that's really going to be looking at getting your views about the sort of the top 3 regulatory ecosystem problems that you feel RegTech could solve. It's a multiple choice question. Grateful for your response to that. And while we're doing that, we will now transition to our second panel. It's called Show Me the Money, or maybe not. I think on the program it's called Investability and bringing the models to market. So thank you very much, panel 1. We're now going to transition to panel 2.
Doing business in Africa. You can't afford to be without Africa Investor.